Hi, my name is Dani, and thank you for coming to my talk on how digital tools in FemTech unlock a $50 billion market. Hi, welcome to my talk. My name is Dani, and today I'll be talking about how digital tools in FemTech unlock a $50 billion market. So to kind of get an idea of what I'm going to be talking with you about today, first I'd like to give you a little bit of an introduction of who I am and the company that I work for. I'll go over the challenges between making a diagnosis, the digital tools that are solving these challenges, and new ways that digital tools are being deployed in real life that need to be a consideration when developing a way of managing FemTech. Finally, I'll give you an outlook of where we see the space going. So first and foremost, one of the things that we like to do at my company, Lux Research, is find ways to help make decisions about tech innovation. So one of the things that I do the most of is market landscaping. I do in-depth analyses of technology, opportunity assessments, all with the idea of helping develop ways to make good strategic decisions for our clients. If anything resonates with you in my talk today, please feel free to reach out. I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you might have. At the end of this presentation, there will be a slide for contact information. So, to get into my talk, the big shock, women's health often takes a really long time to diagnose. In fact, if you're wondering about this figure on the right, and you're wondering why in particular it might be a Mayan calendar, it's because in many cases it feels as though a diagnosis, the time that it takes to get a diagnosis, can be measured in terms of centuries. Endometriosis takes an average of 7 years, or actually I should say the median time that it takes to get a diagnosis of endometriosis is 7 years. And for polycystic ovarian syndrome, it's about 2. And these typically mean that women are spending either 2 or 7 years in excruciating pelvic pain before they can actually get the help they need. The reasons that it takes a long time to get a diagnosis are often very complicated, and they boil down to 2 groups of factors. First, the focus on women's health is a very specific use case for a wide variety of reasons. The typical example of this is a lot of money is spent looking at maternity care and pregnancy. The other reason is that it's very hard to tease apart a diagnosis when the majority of the symptoms are the same. So to kind of unpack a little bit of that first reason, visibility is an issue. Oftentimes, a lot of these diseases are hidden, unlike pregnancy, which becomes really obvious as you come closer to your due date. The second is representation. So a lot of the firms that are actually funding a lot of the innovation happening in FemTech are largely populated by male individuals. And while the parity between venture capital between men and women is starting to become more equal, it's not currently the case. And so oftentimes it's hard to fund something you don't see or understand. Third, there's a significant issue of shame. Women are taught that they shouldn't be talking about particularly these parts of their bodies, and it becomes really difficult to understand where the problems are if they're not being communicated effectively. Finally, there's an issue of perspective. It's really easy for large companies in terms of medtech and pharma to really understand why it's important to spend a lot of money on solving issues like diabetes and cardiovascular disease, but it's often much more challenging when it comes down to FemTech because it's just not, first of all, visible, but also there's so much money to be made, obviously and immediately, in these other conditions. So to tease apart the reasons behind the second issue, so it's hard to develop a diagnosis, all of the symptoms for a lot of these diseases are the same. So you're looking at things like pain and weird hair growth, irregular or irregularly heavy menses, and then infertility. The second reason is that a lot of times the data that you need to make a diagnosis isn't really easy to get in a single visit or in a doctor's appointment or in a single blood test. Oftentimes these symptoms are really cyclical, and it requires the collection of longitudinal data, which can be really, really challenging. As a result, the diagnosis of these conditions is often more guesswork and experimentation rather than a data-based solution without a more invasive procedure. And often these more invasive procedures, for good reasons, are last resorts. However, fortunately, unlike diagnostics in medicine, we don't actually have to wonder why it's taken so long to develop these FemTech solutions. Instead, We can look at the actual solutions that are being implemented digitally right now. We don't have to untangle this enormous problem. We can instead focus on current opportunities in front of us and actually work to solve them. So digital tools, first and foremost, are really the future of women's health for a number of reasons that I'm going to demonstrate for you now. But before I share that bit, it's important to really get a sense of what this fundamental underpinning of different digital tools that we see in the femtech space today is, and that's computer vision. The solutions of today and tomorrow rely on computer vision. If you're sitting here as a medical professional, as part of this conference, and you don't really know what computer vision is, all it is essentially a means of systems or algorithms or different components that allow machines to extract information from visual data or to see. That visual data often comes in the form of graphs of data or also images. And to give you a sense of the scope of this and how long it's been going on, in 2010, so 10 years ago, Stanford created the ImageNet competition. In the first competition, the software program that was written had a 30% error rate, which is pretty significant, especially if you're talking about something like medicine. But then 2 years later, they were able to surpass that by almost 10%. And now where we are, starting around 2015 and moving forward, a lot of these software programs and algorithms are capable of outperforming an actual human in terms of being able to classify an image. And this is technology that we're seeing leveraged in a variety of fields today, be it cancer diagnosis, be it drug discovery. All of these are really relying on computer vision. Computer vision is especially important for telehealth because a lot of the services held within telehealth, such as remote monitoring and mHealth, are all really relying on computer vision as their backbone. By layering in computer vision, they're able to demonstrate diagnostic capability in a way that you wouldn't necessarily be able to get outside of the clinic. And one way this is really being leveraged, and I think one of the key ways, is that we have companies that are looking to combine the wet work of sample collection, so things like menstrual blood and tissue, and then applying different computer vision algorithms to that data that is extracted from those wet lab samples in order to help facilitate a diagnosis. So some of the companies that are working on this are, Corasense and NextGen Jane, and what they're really doing is putting out products that an individual can use and then mail in. And what they're looking to build diagnostics capabilities for are things like STDs, which are often silent in women, endometriosis, and polycystic ovarian syndrome. The next way that computer vision is really a fundamental innovation is for remote monitoring. And remote monitoring is really a key opportunity for this for a number of different reasons. Remote monitoring often means wearables, and that means that you can have a discrete form factor to collect different types of data. You can be collecting data continuously, so across a woman's cycle, so you get that longitudinal data that's so important in these cases. And wearables typically capture multiple data sets. As you're developing a diagnostic, it's not always clear immediately what the key piece of data is that unlocks the puzzle. And so being able to collect and analyze groups of data is actually very important. Furthermore, and this may be more of a buzzword now for a lot of people here, digital biomarkers are increasingly important in diagnostics capabilities, and digital biomarkers derived from wearables for women's health really offer a significant value proposition in this space. Now, I have to address the elephant in the room. The reality is that we've seen a big burst in femtech, and a lot of it is centered around period trackers. And the two words that I really have to say about this are be careful. Because fundamentally, it's important to be able to track and keep a record of a woman's cycle over a period of time, no pun intended, in order to help determine whether or not there's an issue or a problem. However, many period trackers, in addition to being in a fairly saturated market, which I should note, this is not a complete market map. I just wanted to show, the key ones that have shown up in searches. And as you can see, it's already a fairly saturated landscape. But two of the key real issues here are that, one, privacy is often a second or even third thought, and this is actually really important when you're trying to establish trust as a medical system. So privacy is key, but also from a biological perspective, most of the algorithms that are developed for these particular apps are locked into the 28-day cycle. The 28-day cycle, as most of you probably know, is a good starting point. It's the textbook for having a menstrual cycle, but it's not actually reality. It's not actually something that represents all women. And so having a live and living algorithm that's able to augment itself to an individual cycle is actually very important. So if you're going to go down this road, you really need to keep those two things in mind, that first, privacy is key, and second, understanding that 28 days is not set in stone. I've now showed you ways that women's health can be very challenging to actually diagnose. I've shown you a little bit of the tools that are being used, but equally important is to understand how these tools are actually being leveraged in the real world. I feel a little bit like this might be the obligatory COVID-19 slide, but even before COVID-19, diagnostics paradigms were changing, and even now, that's happening more so. Early identification and intervention make for really efficient use of resources. And when you have hospitals that are crowding and there's a huge challenge to making sure that everyone gets the care they need and having to make difficult decisions, it's important to have as much information as you can as early as possible, making that efficient diagnosis that facilitates the good use of resources. More now than ever, the geographical location of point of care has become critical. When individuals cannot travel to sites or actually get to sites or be in certain sites, it's important to consider where they can actually be receiving care. Telehealth now more than ever as a remote provision of care is much more established. We're actually seeing uptick in older generations of individuals, which is something that historically we haven't seen. The comfort level is there for telehealth, and so being able to launch a digital service is actually a really great time. We need to really be considering how these different paradigms, both as a result of COVID-19 and not, are changing, and use those shifts to fuel innovation opportunities. So what healthcare paradigms are shifting, you might ask? Well, the first major paradigm shift, which has been happening for a while, is the when of care provision. So historically, we've thought of healthcare as being a binary between healthy and severe disease individuals. But the reality is you don't go from one to the other overnight, typically. There's often a spectrum. And so being able to address individuals at different points of the spectrum can actually help pause or prevent the movement from the left of the spectrum, where you're healthy and at risk, into pre-disease and disease states. So being able to understand when the ideal point of providing care or when the ideal point is for a diagnosis in order to better manage a condition has become increasingly important. The next major paradigm shift is the where of provision of care. Historically, there are two major locations that we think of when we see healthcare: the clinic or the hospital. More recently, we've seen a move into the home. So we have, three major pillars of care, and I would say over the past 10 years, the home has really seen a rise in importance. However, innovations have meant that the areas that an individual can get care have really changed. And there's actually a whole bunch of emerging locations of care where you can really step in and take advantage of things happening either when someone's, at the gym or exercising or in the office or, on their commute. Anywhere they could be is really an opportunity for you to step in with some measure of care. And understanding that these paradigms are shifting and kind of developing these pictures and these ideas and landscapes can really help you triangulate on where the best opportunities are. And in order to demonstrate what I'm really talking about, because I understand this is a little bit of a high-level concept, I'm going to give you a couple of case studies. So the first case study is NextGen Jane, which I'd mentioned earlier, uses sanitary products to collect women's either menstrual blood or their tissues, or actually it's both, to be honest with you. They collect all of this in order to help identify different disease states. This particular product and this company is actually able to provide care anywhere that there is a restroom where an individual might be able to change out their sanitary product and mail it. So this could be happening, in the home. It could be happening in an office. As long as there's a regular restroom that's accessible, this is a possibility. And really the time frame in which that they're looking to address is trying to identify healthy individuals and see if they can identify when someone becomes at risk and pre-disease. And that doesn't necessarily mean that they're looking to stop the disease entirely, but to get an idea of what that spectrum looks like is still largely a black box for the medical community. And so being able to collect this data is really critical. The fact that NextGen Jane is taking the more traditional wet lab approach and then combining it with computer vision is what's really making them successful. The next example, which I'm happy to announce only happened a couple of weeks ago, is the partnership between Shugai and Bioformis, which is looking to manage and monitor pain due to endometriosis. So they're looking to find a way to quantify the pain by looking at things like contraction data, by looking at muscle spasm data, as well as the subjective scoring, to help really understand the cyclical nature of endometriosis pain. And they're doing this with a combination of wearables and computer vision, and then Shugai's own expertise. They're addressing something that is specifically an illness, so they're looking at a much tighter range. So they're looking at risk, but also pre-disease in individuals who definitely have endometriosis to really map out what these pain cycles look like. And due to the form factor that's being used, there's a lot of flexibility in where this data collection and thus diagnostic capability is happening. So on the commute, at the grocery store, in an office, while exercising, it's possible to start collecting this data to help drive the diagnostic need. And really, I think one of the cool takeaways from this particular partnership is that both traditional pharma and digital startups are working together. And so it's not just a case of one big stakeholder going in and doing something. It's this real opportunity to work together with the new kids on the block in the startup landscape, really being able to leverage their own agility and digital capabilities with the larger, more traditional organizations. The final example I'm going to give is Bloomer Tech. So Bloomer Tech is a company that builds cardiac monitoring wearables, and what they actually do is they build that wearable into the underwire of a bra. And what they're able to do is track the cardiac output of an individual, which is also really important because even though we've known since the early 90s that heart attacks and cardiovascular disease present differently in women than men, there haven't really been a lot of major studies to really, become actionable about this. And so their focus on women's heart health has been really key to driving their own growth in their company. And again, because it's a fairly straightforward wearable, this is something that anywhere a woman can wear a bra, she can be collecting data to help drive her diagnosis. And so this is really a neat shift from what used to be, historically the hospital with the giant, EKG to the even more, less large, but still kind of irritating Holter monitor, to something that you can actually wear as part of a normal piece of clothing to really help you monitor, or really help an individual monitor their own health. And I think this is really where some of the real key opportunities are in finding these continuously monitoring non-invasive tools to really help drive the collection of data and thus drive the diagnostic capabilities. So now that I've told you all this, what are really the next steps? So first, it's important to adopt digital tools for the collection of data. The use of digital tools like computer vision are really opening up new vistas in the FemTech landscape. Second, look for gaps in the timing of a diagnosis. Right now, I understand we're super focused on, we have someone in a disease state, let's actually put our finger on that. But it's also possible to look a little bit earlier before that and see if there's anything that can be done to kind of get at-risk people before the disease becomes an issue. Is it possible to change the course of a disease? These are all things that a solid diagnosis is the foundational building block of. Finally, look for opportunities outside the clinic. It's a lot easier for a lot of the major medtech and biotech companies to really focus on the clinic because those are the traditional spaces where diagnostics have occurred. But that's really changing, and being able to come up with some kind of diagnostic biomarker from something that's wearable that doesn't require an individual to sit and have an invasive test is really going to be important in the coming years. So, as for an outlook, it's really been touted that FemTech represents an estimated $50 billion opportunity that has been largely untapped, but that is changing. There are now a much wider array of stakeholders that are developing diagnostic solutions. There are pharmaceutical companies, medtech, big tech, wearables, startups. All of these players are all starting to really hone in on FemTech as this underserved opportunity. And if you get nothing else from my talk today, companies that leverage digital tools to either facilitate or supplement diagnostic protocols will be the winners in future markets, and so it is critical that you start to adopt them now. As I said earlier, if anything in this talk has really resonated with you, please don't hesitate to reach out. I know our team would be more than happy to hear from you. Hope you have an excellent day.